137 meters in length, 23 meters in width, 3 complete floors. These were the dimensions that God had revealed to Noah, supernaturally detailed, precise, and objective. The celestial order left no room for uncertainties. Build yourself an ark. And before that voice, one of the greatest constructions ever executed by human force began. The scriptures reveal the dimensions of the ark, the material and its purpose. But to transform that order into planks, beams, and architecture, Noah would need to face monumental obstacles. Obstacles that the text does not specify, but that any builder of that era would understand. And it all begins with what many overlook: the ground. A construction with 137 meters in length cannot be raised on just any site. It demands extensive area, firm, unbreakable, distant from dangerous slopes and close to the cypress forests, which would function as raw material. Therefore, visualize Noah traversing the territory, examining the earth, verifying the solidity of the ground, the proximity of the trees, the viability, without equipment, without architects, without blueprints, only discernment, practical intelligence, and trust. And when he located the perfect space, the initial stage began, and it had nothing majestic about it. Removing enormous rocks, extracting deep roots, leveling each section, consolidating the terrain to resist tons of wood, all with rudimentary instruments, but with a resolve driven by the word. But there was something that made the work even more complex in the pre-Diluvian universe: the permanent humidity that ascended from the earth. The Bible explains that a mist ascended from the earth and irrigated the entire extension of the ground. Genesis 2:6. This means that the ground was frequently wet by essence, and wet ground can transform into mud. Instruments sink. Wood absorbs water. The terrain becomes vulnerable. Therefore, Noah possibly needed to excavate small furrows around the place, establishing basic diversions so that the natural water of the ground would not flood the work region. It was not rain descending from the firmament, it was the earth itself releasing moisture. While he executed this, people passed by observing. Some mocked, others murmured. What purpose does preparing such a gigantic territory have? But Noah did not respond, for he was not building looking at human logic. He was building looking at the celestial instruction. And when finally the territory was firm, leveled and sufficiently dry, a new obstacle presented itself before him: the obtaining of wood for a colossal construction. The Bible affirms, "Build the ark of cypress wood." And the cypresses were not diminutive trunks. They were colossal trees, resistant, massive, perfect for a construction of that dimension. Felling a tree like that with primitive instruments, barely with strength, patience, and persistence. Felling hundreds was a process that demanded continuous discipline. Blow after blow, trunk after trunk. Noah and his descendants worked until the thunder of the falling tree resonated through the forest. But the work did not end there. Displacing a gigantic trunk to the place demanded technique, without wheels, without adequate animals, without equipment. The solution was the same used by primitive peoples: wooden cylinders. Smaller trunks were positioned under the larger trunk. With ropes and levers, they dragged slowly, displacing tons of wood a few sections at a time. When the trunk progressed, the cylinders from behind were repositioned to the front, slow, exhausting, dangerous. But each transported trunk was an additional step in the construction of that which God had ordered. And Noah continued, because whoever received an instruction from God does not work for what they observe, they work for what they believe. And while all this was happening, the inhabitants around saw that unusual movement, men transporting colossal trunks toward a gigantic territory. It was natural that many mocked, that others doubted, but none of this stopped Noah, because he did not work motivated by human eyes, but by the instruction that came from God. As the wood accumulated in the territory, the moment arrived to begin the most complex part of the entire construction. Not just cutting and transporting, but erecting a colossal construction that would need to remain firm during the greatest storm in the history of humanity. For the ark to remain firm, straight, and resistant, Noah would need to begin with the foundation, with the backbone of the entire vessel, the keel. The Bible does not describe the procedure, but any primitive builder would understand that a construction of that size demanded an extremely extensive and robust central beam, capable of supporting all the weight of the hull, of the 3 floors, and of the tons of cargo that would come later. But there was a detail impossible to overlook. No tree, however large it was, would reach 137 meters in extension. This means that Noah needed to join several gigantic beams, trunk after trunk, creating a continuous, straight and solid line. A task that demanded technique, precision, and patience. These beams were cut and adjusted with wooden joints, something known since the most primitive civilizations, mortise and tenon systems, which, when well executed, became as firm as entire structures. And to lock those joints, stakes and pegs of hard wood were inserted, creating junction points sufficiently resistant to hold everything in violent storms. When the keel was ready, an impressive moment arose before Noah: the necessity to erect the ribs of the ark. The ribs were arched beams that rose from the sides and gave shape to the hull. The ribs needed to be fitted precisely. Therefore, Noah and his descendants did what primitive builders dominated very well. They created custom joints, carefully carved, that allowed the beams to incline and arch naturally when fixed to the keel. And as those ribs were being erected beside the keel, the form of the ark finally began to emerge before their eyes. Now visualize the scene. Colossal massive beams being lifted by levers, thick ropes, and pure human force. Noah and his descendants pulling, adjusting, correcting angles, observing each centimeter. Because if a rib was tilted excessively, the entire construction would lose balance. For this reason, they possibly used ropes stretched from end to end as orientation lines. They used stones as plumb bobs to guarantee verticality and repeated the procedure dozens of times. When the skeleton of the ark began to take shape, the sight must have been impressive. A gigantic construction of wood emerging where there had never been sea, the size of a modern building, but made barely with rudimentary instruments and human hands. And then a decisive moment arrived: sealing the ark. Because a beautiful construction is not enough, it needed to be waterproof. And God was direct about this. You shall caulk the ark inside and outside. This detail is profound. The bitumen, a resin derived from the earth, needed to be boiled, thickened and applied while still hot, creating a hard and resistant film, but applying barely on the outside would not be adequate. Wood, with time, absorbs moisture, and any infiltration could destroy everything. Then Noah and his descendants spent days, perhaps weeks, covering each crack, each joint, each crevice, both inside and outside. Each layer needed to dry before receiving another, and any failure could compromise the entire project. In the end, when the last part was sealed and hardened, the ark was no longer barely a wooden construction. It was a hermetic refuge projected to face something that had never happened before in the history of humanity. And the next step would be as important as the external construction, organizing the interior to shelter living creatures. The Bible reveals a fundamental detail. You shall make compartments in the ark. The Hebrew term used, kinnigan, literally means nests, cells, small divisions. That is, the ark was not an open shed. It was formed by smaller sections, carefully planned to maintain order, security, and stability during the deluge. And here is an important theological point. The Bible does not describe the design, barely affirms that there were 3 floors and compartments. Based on this, we imagine what would be logical, practical, and possible for Noah. To maintain the balance of the vessel, the most sensible thing would be to organize the animals by weight and size. Lower floor. Heavy animals, elephants, hippopotamuses, large cattle. This would keep the center of gravity low, avoiding dangerous oscillations. Intermediate floor. Medium-sized animals. Lions, bears, deer, larger domestic animals. Upper floor. Birds and smaller animals, lighter, less impact on balance, and closer to ventilation. This division does not contradict the Bible and is totally coherent with such a large construction. The compartments were essential. Without them, predators could attack prey, animals could injure themselves. There would be total chaos inside. Diseases would spread rapidly. Then, Noah possibly built simple internal walls, but sufficiently strong to keep each species in its space. These walls needed to be well fitted, without compromising the integrity of the hull, remembering that each piece of wood added weight and needed to be planned. Ventilation. The Bible mentions, "You shall make an opening of 1 cubit from above." This indicates a kind of extensive, continuous window below the covering. But to ventilate 3 entire floors, Noah possibly made small protected lateral openings, external protrusions that prevented water entry, internal corridors for air circulation, all within the logic of the pre-diluvian environment. Without adequate ventilation, the gases produced by the animals would be deadly. Food storage. A year of food for all creatures meant a colossal quantity of supplies. The Bible affirms, "You shall take with you food for yourself and for them." This included hay, grains, dried fruits, roots, water stored in jars and containers. For this reason, entire areas of the interior of the ark needed to be dedicated solely to food, stored in an organized way and protected from moisture. The ark was more than a ship. It was a floating city with complete logistics, waste disposal, plausible possibilities, slightly inclined floors, simple drainage channels, small lateral openings barely to drain liquids. And when each space, each division, each corridor was ready, Noah perceived that the construction was reaching the most critical point of all, the door. A gigantic opening, sufficiently large to permit the entry of animals of all sizes, and at the same time, sufficiently strong not to compromise the entire construction. The door would be the most vulnerable point of the ark, and also the most symbolic point, because the Bible affirms something extraordinary. The Lord closed the door, man constructed, but God sealed. Among all the elements of the ark, none attracted more attention than the door. The Bible clearly mentions, "And you shall put a door on the side," Genesis 6:16. To prevent the enormous opening from compromising the construction, Noah possibly installed thick beams around the frame, diagonal braces, strong and deep joints, high-resistance wood on the edges, all to guarantee that the door would not become a point of collapse. And remember, Noah did not have adequate metal to create enormous hinges like modern ones. Then, the most plausible system would be a vertical pivot, a great axis of reinforced wood on the side of the door, allowing it to turn with force, but with stable functioning. Here is a precious theological point. The Bible affirms, "And the Lord closed the door." Genesis 7:16. That is, Noah constructed, God sealed. Before the animals arrived, Noah certainly walked through the interior of the ark, testing beams, verifying if the bitumen hardened completely, checking cracks, reinforcing ribs, evaluating the weight of the provisions already loaded, hearing the sounds of the compressed wood. In large wooden constructions, it speaks, creaks, settles, accommodates. And Noah, with experience acquired over the years of construction, would know how to identify if something was wrong. And then, something supernatural happened. The Bible is explicit. The animals came to Noah. They were not captured. They were not led by force. They did not arrive randomly. They came. It seemed like an orchestrated movement, as if an invisible hand was guiding each species. Visualize the scene. pairs of animals emerging among trees, birds perching near the entrance, wild creatures walking tranquilly beside prey. Reptiles crawling in the exact direction, cubs following instincts they had not learned, and each one positioning itself in order, without chaos, without confusion, without attacks. It was the seal that this was not barely a human project. It was a celestial act happening before the eyes of Noah's family. When all entered, animals, birds, reptiles, Noah, his wife, his 3 descendants, and their wives, they also entered 8 people. And then the construction was concluded. Trust had been obeyed. And now the most challenging part began. How Noah and his family survived inside the ark during the days of the deluge. With the door closed by the very hand of God, a different silence took hold of the ark. On the outside, the world continued as if nothing had happened. On the inside, everything was ready. Animals accommodated, compartments organized, food stored, the construction sealed and firm. It was the beginning of something that had never happened in the history of humanity. The Bible describes that moment with solemn words. Year 600 of Noah's life. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Genesis 7:11. This indicates underground waters exploding to the surface, internal pressures released, gigantic volumes of water gushing with force, earthquakes, and deep ruptures over the earth. Noah's family felt the ark shudder, not from the water above, but from the violent movement of the earth below. Subsequently, something even more extraordinary happened. The windows of heaven were opened. It was the first rain in history, and not a common rain. Thick drops, increasing volume, deafening noise on the wood. Thunders resonating, lightnings tearing the firmament. The ark, until then immobile, began to feel the touch of the first waters accumulating around. Visualize the neighbors who laughed at Noah, those who called the ark madness. The Bible does not describe their feelings, but it is easy to imagine. Screams at the unknown rain, terror at the waters rising rapidly, people running without understanding, panic before that which had never happened. The trust that before seemed madness now became the only refuge. The water kept rising, rising, rising until the heavy and firm hull began to float. For Noah and his family, that must have been an indescribable sensation. The wood creaking, the floor vibrating, the initial swaying, the sound of water striking the side, the ark detaching from the earth for the first time. That vessel constructed over decades finally fulfilled its purpose. The ark was not guided by sails, oars, or rudders. It did not need that. It was in the hands of God. The Bible describes, the waters prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth. Genesis 7:19. This represents mountains disappearing, cities submerged, trees uprooted, primitive life being erased before the eyes of Noah's family. On the inside, the ark seemed like its own world. Out there, everything died. In there, God preserved life. The contrast was absolute. How long did the rain last? The sound of rain ceased after 40 days, but the deluge was far from over. The Bible describes, the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Genesis 7:24. Even without rain, the waters continued rising and moving, covering mountains, plains, valleys, and everything that existed before. Inside the ark, time seemed motionless. There was work every day, feeding the animals, cleaning the compartments, verifying the beams, reinforcing joints, monitoring stability, praying, waiting. And then, after extensive months of waiting, the biblical narrative reveals a decisive moment. And God remembered Noah. Genesis 8:1. The Bible affirms that God sent a wind over the earth and the waters began to lower. Slowly, day after day, the level began to diminish until the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. Genesis 8:4. After months of partial darkness, Noah opened the upper window. For the first time since the beginning of the deluge, fresh air entered with force. Natural light filled the interior of the ark, but he still had no way to know if the earth was ready. Then he made a logical and wise decision. He released a raven. Subsequently, he released a dove. The dove returned, for it found no perch. The world was still in waters. A week later, Noah tried again. The dove returned, but this time carrying an olive leaf. It was the first sign of recommencement. Another week passed. Noah released the dove for the third time and it did not return. The earth finally began to become habitable again. After more than a year inside the ark, God spoke again. "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your descendants, and the wives of your descendants with you." Genesis 8:16. And Noah obeyed. The door, that same one that God had closed, was now opened. An intense light invaded the interior. The animals began to exit, species by species, following their instincts, dispersing through the new earth. The entire family stepped on firm ground for the first time in many months. The smell of wet earth, the pure air, the profound silence. Everything was new. Nothing of the primitive world had survived, but the grace of God preserved adequate life for a recommencement. As soon as he left the ark, Noah did something symbolic, powerful, memorable. He erected an altar to the Lord. There, among rocks, dry mud and the beginning of a restored landscape, Noah offered a sacrifice. The Bible describes that God was pleased with the sweet smell and made a promise. "Never again will I destroy all life with waters." And then he placed a visible sign in the firmament, the rainbow, an eternal alliance, reminding humanity that even in judgment, God preserves a remnant, sustains life, and opens a path of trust. With the deluge finished, the ark had fulfilled its purpose. Now a new chapter began. Noah and his family would repopulate the earth. Nations would arise from Noah's descendants. The world would gain new cycles, seasons, and limits established by God. The history of redemption would continue forward. From that vessel would be born all post-diluvian humanity. And the ark, symbol of obedience, trust, and salvation, remained as testimony that God always rescues those who trust in His voice. If you reached this point, you already realized. The ark was not barely a boat. It was an act of trust placed in wood. It was salvation preserved in 3 floors. It was the celestial answer to sin, and at the same time, proof of God's love for life. But Noah's story does not end in the ark. There is much more about the recommencement of humanity, the new alliance, the generations that came subsequently, and how all that connects to God's greater plan. If you want to continue discovering the mysteries and revelations that transformed biblical history, subscribe to the channel right now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any episode.